Kate Stehr is a sculptor based in the Illawarra on the south coast of New South Wales. Her art is a celebration of history and memory, and she reinvents objects that would otherwise be discarded. Kate's creations dance on the fine line between contemporary sculpture and the artisan craftsmanship, balancing abstraction with elements of realism. The forms can appear organic, somewhat familiar, yet definitely curious. The touch by a machine or human evident, yet always relating back to the natural world. A trained sculptor with a Masters of Philosophy in Creative Arts Research, an advanced diploma and Bachelor in Fine Arts, Kate has been a visual arts teacher for over 13 years, while her art making has been a constant passion for much longer. Kate's portfolio spans various conceptual subjects, with her masters delving into the translation of narratives into physical forms. Through material selection, construction techniques, and the appropriation of everyday found objects, she explored presentations that embody the contradictions and ambiguities integral to our lives through contemporary sculpture. The abstraction of form and the playful exploration of sculptural lines extend into her wall pieces, where the use of space adds another layer of context. Kate's absurdist structures, often incorporating found objects, invite viewers to delve into narratives held by the sculptures, prompting questions about their purpose, ownership, and stories. Inspired by a transformative trip to Tonga, where she swam with humpback whales, Kate's recent series Plankton seeks to make the minuscule visible. By shedding light on aesthetic beauty of unseen life forms, she aims to reinforce our interconnectedness and reliance on both microscopic and grand creatures in our world. Kate's works have been exhibited nationally and internationally, and she has been the recipient of a number of sculptural awards, including the 𝗞𝘁𝗲 Emerging Sculptor Prize. Her works are also part of the Wollongong Art Gallery's permanent collection. And in 2021, Kate was awarded an artist residency for her entry into the Defiance Sculptor Prize. So let's hear more about thinking through making, objects with multiple interpretations, the tactile nature of her materials, as we welcome you, wherever you are joining us from, and Kate Stehr, this week's Friday Feature Artist.
Wow. Thank you, Tara. That was beautiful. What a beautiful intro. Thank you so much.
What an amazing body of work. And so before we get into how amazing that is, welcome back everybody to Friday Feature Artist, and thank you so much for tuning in. Whilst this is not live, we still encourage you to leave comments and we'll endeavour to get back to you. And we just love hearing more about you and where you're from. So welcome everybody, and please let us know where you are joining us from. But yes, over to you, Kate. That was just such an incredible body of work. It's fabulous to see all of your objects.
Yeah, look, I don't think you spend a lot of time as an artist looking back. I mean, you obviously are influenced by past series of works, and sometimes they're still sitting in the studio, but you generally pack stuff up and box it up and put it away, particularly in my studio space where everything's covered in sawdust all of the time. So yeah, that was really beautiful to be able to see a little bit of an overview of some of the things I've made. Thank you, Tara. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's great. And, we are passionate about all things fibre arts here, and I still feel like wood is definitely a fibre and comes into that realm. Often, I guess, a lot of our viewers and makers are working with predominantly textiles and softer fibres. So, you studied fine art, and out of all of the disciplines, what ultimately drew you to sculpture?
I had that introduction to TAFE. That was my first step back in after I was a chef. I was studying commercial cookery prior to that, and just realised that I enjoyed plating the food, and I was kind of kidding myself, and thinking that I had to get a real job meant that I had to go and study chefing. But when I went into TAFE and had that first year and had the opportunity to study or sort of taste test, basically, I suppose, all of the major mediums, I just really fell in love with the idea. You could never have picked it, or I would never have picked it, but that idea of the three-dimensional space, being able to work in three-dimensional forms. I loved both the reductive process of, getting a lump of clay and sort of peeling that back and finding what lay inside it. And I suppose from the photos that you saw there, I love the found object, and I love repurposing the found object. So yeah, I did that as well. I got advanced standing into National Art School and did photography and sculpture in second year. But when I had to make that kind of final decision, moving into third year at National Art School, it was sculpture all the way. I was deeply passionate about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's not a logical progression from kitchen and cookery to wood and sculpture, but it kind of does make sense. And even, like you said, the arranging of items.
Oh, food on a plate. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, look, it makes me laugh because I sort of think there's probably nothing logical in any of the decisions I feel like I've made sometimes in my life. But, look, it just... I think that, and I've reflected, and again, I think probably doing my master's many years later, I was forced to reflect a little bit more deeply on the whys and the hows. Both of my grandparents, my grandfathers, one was a carpenter and one was a shoemaker. I observed both of those, in their respective studios, and I think that definitely had a big impact on me. My dad, was an electrician, but he was a very handy man, and he was very capable in, his use of tools. And he certainly, having three daughters, he showed us what he would have probably showed if he'd had a son. So we got that opportunity to, we were never shy from, using all of his bits and bobs in his shed too. So I feel like it's probably a little bit illogical without those background threads, but the more I reflected, the more it sort of seemed like, particularly the use of timber for me, where that sort of came from. I sort of, it resonated with me because of a lot of the history there.
Yeah, I think that thing, me personally, when I look at wood, and I think that's amazing, but then I get to the point where you've got to move beyond blue tack and PVA, and I see your creations, and I think, well, obviously you're a woman who's confident with tools. And there has to be some point along the way that makes sense that, tools become part of your life. So that sort of grandparent, father growing up with tools, and then just kind of having.
Yeah, I feel like, we were definitely not discouraged from, there was no sort of, gender bias towards us picking stuff up. And my mother was an exceptional artist. She didn't really pursue it, but so I've got some of her early sketchbooks, and she was very talented. So I think all of her three daughters, art making was certainly encouraged. And both of my elder sisters, the art work that they did throughout high school and even past high school, I still think are beautiful pieces. So there was definitely, a nurturing kind of aspect there towards artistry. Which made me more confident to jump into it. I think moving from the chefing to applying at TAFE was a bit of a scary leap, but, it's obviously paid off for me in the end.
And so when I think sculpture, and then I'm kind of thinking about the materials, and so then the next thing I kind of think of is size. And again, we'll talk specifically about sort of the sizes that you're working in, because it's often difficult, and especially when we're seeing things on screen, to gain a sense of scale. And perhaps people think of sculpture as huge wall hangings or things on stone plinths, or, big chunky entranceway type sculptures. So what's the appeal of the object, and particularly the small tactile object, to you versus the big sort of honking great sculpture?
Yeah, and look, I have made bigger stuff for Sculpture by the Sea, and it's just very interesting to me that I just have that natural inclination towards making smaller work. So it is something that I've thought about, and I do remember, sculpture lectures where they talked about sculpture shouldn't be human scale, so sculpture should be either much bigger than a human in order to sort of, that has its own interaction that we have with that three-dimensional form, or it should be something that's an intimate scale. I think and also, obviously with my background in teaching as well, I would talk to year 12 students about the length of time that a HSC marker would spend with their work after they'd potentially spent, hundreds and hundreds of hours making this thing, whatever it was. And we were told, because of the number of students being marked, it's about 7 minutes per artwork. And I'm a big observer of people, and I've noted that you could spend, 3 years of your life putting together a solo exhibition. And it's not that people aren't interested. It's just that we have shorter and shorter attention spans. But we like to sort of look and then move on. And I think the more experienced person who goes to galleries might spend longer, or might, do a quick run around and then go back. But predominantly people don't spend a huge amount of time on viewing. And I think that the small scale for me may have been a bit of an obtuse kind of response to that in some ways. I think I definitely do intrinsically make smaller works, but the idea that when something's smaller, that you have to kind of get close and you have to peer and you have to, and I'm also, I think, interested in making people wonder how things were put together. And I don't think of myself as a highly skilled craftsman. I think that I've sort of fumbled and worked my way into, proficiency. But, I think I said to you prior to this interview, I don't have any formal carpentry training. I could probably do with some, but the idea that if people look at my objects, I'm hoping that they will go, I can sort of see how she put that together with that, but how did she put that with that? And that makes them spend more time. So I'm hoping to encourage people to spend more time with the works by making them intimately scaled and by making them a little bit absurd, I suppose.
Yeah, I think people bandy around the phrase go big or go home, and it can be tempting to sort of go for that shock value and impact. But I would say that sort of intimate, connectedness about the smaller thing can still have impact. So looking at this is, and I was lucky to see some of your work recently in the Defiance Gallery in Sydney as part of their 6x6. They call it the Small Sculpture or whatever.
Yeah, it's been renamed now as the Small Sculpture Prize, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
So this is one of your pieces from 2021. Can you tell us, that looks like you totally know your way around the tools and craftsmanship and all of those things that you just claimed you didn't have. Can you tell us a bit about this piece?
Yeah, look, they sort of harken back to my third year at National Art School. I'd done a trip to Cambodia to Siem Reap and, done, many long hours gazing at these beautiful temples over there. And I came back and wanted to see whether or not I could make forms that were architecturally inspired, basically. But again, I suppose that absurd quality that I just seem to love exploring, they sort of, in my mind, I wanted them to be Escher-esque, or, as a kid, I loved the movie The Labyrinth, and there's the scene where David Bowie's, chasing Sarah through this, labyrinthine staircase that twists and turns. So this idea that the work, it can be viewed from any angle being a sculpture, but the leading lines of the stairs and the ladders draw your eye. What I was hoping to achieve was in a sort of circular motion and an undulating motion in and out around the sculpture. So I also just like to challenge myself, and those little ladders, jointing those little ladders together that you see on the left-hand side, they were really quite tricky for me. I think I've gotten better at making them, and I will certainly go back to them as ladders have been a big motif for me for many years. I just think that they're ripe with symbolism.
Definitely. But, and I love that contrast between the circular and then the more angular, like that. It's just
yeah, me too. Yeah, and I liked the idea that the work was predominantly balancing on the edge of one of those ladders, and then just one other small point of the sort of more solid form. But yeah, I really enjoyed making those pieces. I think. And again, I'd mentioned to you prior to this interview, making 6x6 inch sculptures sounds like it would just be, a normal day in the studio. But it's every year it's wonderfully challenging, because a sculpture would generally, for me, be the size that it is. And whilst that might be small, that can range from, small being this or small being this. It is what it wants to be. But when you're asked to make something that is confined by those limits, you know, it's amazing how many times that they want to break free. So there's plenty of work that I've made that didn't make the cut, so to speak.
And so these pieces were from last year's exhibition, the small sculpture prize.
Yeah. Yep.
And so they're obviously a series of vessels.
Yeah, so I had the wonderful opportunity in 2023 to be a part of a group exhibition with two other artists, Hayley West, or Hayley A. West, and Natalia Shin. And that was just a great experience to be able to bounce ideas off two other artists working in, you know, two very different mediums of ceramics and painting. And one of the collaborations that happened in the lead up to that exhibition came in the form of Hayley sending me down ceramic forms that she'd made, vessels that she'd made, and I was really worried that what my response sculpturally would be, but it was just really enjoyable, and so that led me to thinking about, you know, could I carve my own timber forms, or could I repurpose existing timber objects? So I started. That sort of led me down the path of both carving my own timber forms and repurposing things that I find in op shops sometimes, but turned timber forms that I then, you know, obviously heavily adulterate to get to the point that I want before adding, you know, what other elements they need.
Yeah. And I mean, I love that whole idea of repetition and pattern, because it's found in nature. And then seeing that on these forms, instantly you're making that connection back to the organic world. Well, that's my assumption. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
No, I do, and I actually enjoy the process though as well of physically making things with a repetitive mark making. I don't know why that is, but it scratches an itch for me. But I also love the fact that it results in something that has correlation to nature, but it also makes the forms more tactile, obviously, as well. And then when you work with that black Japan stain that I've been working with a little bit recently, and carve back into that kind of contrast of colours as well, I just think, it's just, I mean, I know social media can be a bane, but the opportunity on Instagram to link to different artists and see what they're using to carve things, and then from that finding, you know, different carving bits has been really wonderful in the last couple of years for me.
Yeah, so many questions, but I can just hear the people who are not live and I think their fingers are on the keyboard. So what kind of tools do you use for something like that? Is it a bit that you put on a panel, or?
Yeah, look, there's no set, you know, you don't sort of start with one. It just depends on the work. But for a work like that, I would probably start with a solid block of timber. I'd cut it up on my bandsaw to be roughly, you know, a geometric version of that black central form. I then go in with sort of bigger carving tools, things like, I've got a little bit of show and tell here, but things like the Arbortech. There's also an Arbortech disc that you can get that goes onto a grinder. So that one's, you know, probably 3 times the size of the blade on this. And these are a dream. I mean, you really do need to wear a face shield, long sleeves, because I find that when the bits are spitting up at you, you know, from experience, it's a long sleeve face shield kind of process. And I also recommend doing it outside because stuff goes everywhere. I then go in with sort of I know everyone will have seen before a Dremel, which I use very regularly. And that's just a brand. It's just a rotary tool, and there's lots of different ones. Everyone's got their favourite. It's a bit like, I don't know, cameras, I suppose. Some people like Nikon and some people like other brands. This is a die grinder, and you can sort of see comparatively with the carving bits on the top. Obviously, this is, you know, you're more industrial. You're still roughing the shape out, and then later on I'll go in with finer bits. Once I get things sort of to a shape that I'm happy with, this tool here is just the best thing ever. I would replace this immediately if something happened to it. And I've had different versions of it before, and cheaper ones that I used to replace pretty regularly because it does get a beating. And I've spent a little bit more money on this one now because it's my favorite tool basically. So it's a power file, and that you can just get little belts. So it's a bit like a belt sander, but that long nose for me just makes sanding a dream. And then unfortunately you have to get to the hand sanding part, which, you know, is for a timber sculpture is my least favorite bit. But you know, put a podcast in your headphones, and yeah, you just got to get through it, because yeah, that's part of being a timber sculptor is a lot of sand.
The thing that you just had then, it kind of made me think of like when you discover a jigsaw and how amazing that is to sort of get the right one. And then that seemed like just kind of like the fingers becoming a sander, like an electronic.
Oh, it's just a dream. And you know, you can get different grits of the belts like you can in any sort of sandpaper, or like you can get for the drum sanders on the Dremel. So again, you can go from quite a rough sand through to quite a fine sand. The only sort of thing, it does take a little bit of technique because the nose is long and thin when you first start using it. I find different models, they sometimes leave a line, but like a little sort of jittery line behind. But once you get confidence with it, it's very easy to avoid that.
And, you know, maybe traditionally as many women, we might be using the KitchenAid, and we've, you know, got all the tools and stuff in the kitchen. But how did you learn to use all these, you know, really impressive power tools? Was it, did you get taught, or could you go somewhere?
I actually have to praise TAFE for that. I feel like the instruction for the Advanced Diploma of Fine Arts was so hands-on.
Correct.
And its whole sort of underlying ethos was to ensure that you were confidently and safely using tools. National Art School was a wonderful place, and I definitely got lots of assistance there too, but I don't feel I would have felt as confident walking into National Art School, particularly because I went straight into second year, if I hadn't had that underpinning at TAFE, because they had wonderful teachers there who were confident in a range of sculptural forms and materials. And equally wonderful general assistants who, you know, one who was there who was just devoted to sculpture, so knew every tool. And you would just go and ask, like, I want to do this. How do I do this? Like, what would you suggest is the best tool that I use, or how would you join this? So I feel like definitely TAFE and National Art School were wonderful, but I've got to be honest, Tara, a lot of it I've just bumbled along, and I've done things probably the hard way for many years, and then I discover, you know, someone mentions, oh, have you ever tried this tool? And I go, no, you know, tell me all about it, you know. So I think you can work a bit of silo.
We need a few sort of men's sheds, or just places that could spring up for the weekend and just kind of like, you know, introduction to power tool workshops and things.
Yeah, I know. I feel like that, you know, and I encourage anyone who is interested in doing work with power tools to go and do one of those courses. But I feel like it's, you know, there's a lot of women out there who've got toolkits that they probably just don't feel comfortable. If you're using, you know, a lot of the equipment in the kitchen, it's the exact same process, really. I feel like there's just that a little bit of there's still a remaining sort of idea that that's men's equipment. And I certainly, I don't obviously just subscribe to that.
Yeah, you know, and people can still injure, have injuries on a sewing machine. So, you know, like it's all just kind of getting to know your own power.
You can burn yourself on the oven. You can, you know, there's a trillion things. You can injure yourself with a hair straightener. Like, you know, there's a trillion things that you can do to injure yourself. I think it's a fear thing. And I know when I've delivered courses on timber sculpture at National Art School, I was doing some holiday workshops there. That was the big thing, was the fear. And once people were shown how to use a drop saw safely, or how to use a circular saw safely, you know, if something can go wrong, of course, if you're not safe. But if you're just making sure things are clamped properly, you've got PPE on, it's generally, you know, you'll be fine.
Yeah, clamping and visors, that's sure. So you mentioned Hayley before, and so I've got these couple of works. So, what was the sort of thinking behind these gorgeous pieces?
Yeah, I do love these works. I just think that they were really successful. So Hayley, we were all responding to the Royal National Park, which is up near Guyamea, which is also equally close to where Hazelhurst Art Gallery is. We have all, spent a lot of time in that national park prior to this group exhibition starting up. And so when we were brainstorming, what was it that we wanted to do? And the idea that we wanted this exhibition to be predominantly collaborative artworks, the national park sort of hit us as something that we all resonated with. So Hayley was making ceramic forms that responded for her to elements of the national park, and then she would send them to me, and I would respond in kind, both to her response in the form of a ceramic vessel, but also from my own sort of experiences in the national park, walking through the rain or the most beautiful gum trees that you see up there. Obviously, these are abstracted distillations of, memory for me. So people might say, how is that, the national park? But for me, they are evocative of, rainstorms or the rivers flowing through that area or the gum trees that are there. So, yeah, I really enjoyed making those pieces.
Yeah. And, I think that is part of the viewer's job, isn't it? Like, you've kind of provided that prompt, and then it's up to the viewer to come up with their fully formed interpretation, which may be unique and personal to each.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I had I was taking down a hanging wall sculpture recently, and the owner of the gallery's little daughter was there, and she was chatting to me as I was packing up all of these little abstract elements, and it was a delight to have her sitting with me, because she was a very bright young girl, but also because as I was picking up forms, she would tell me what they reminded her of, that reminded her of a sea urchin, or that reminded her of, the chrysalis of a caterpillar. And whilst they may not have always been exactly what I was thinking when I was carving them, I'm also not, I've never had any desire to be so set in stone with what I'm trying to say that it can't be interpreted other ways, because otherwise, I kind of don't think there's much point. That's the joy, I think, is that other people will see and use their experience to view your works.
Yeah. Now, I'm hoping that there's going to be an opportunity to view this again, as I was really annoyed I missed it last year. But this piece, and now I feel everyone's zooming closer in, their noses are touching it.
Yeah.
So beautiful, so intriguing.
Yeah, it's now I now made 3 hanging works, this one and another 2, and I had just been making lots and lots of elements, because the other 2 artists, Natalia and Hayley, were both based in Sydney. A lot of our communication, just because of the geography and where we were all working, was by text messages and phone calls. We would meet, and we tried to do that as often as we could. But there were definitely periods of time where I'd sort of felt like I'd finished a piece to the best of my ability, and I needed feedback on it that kind of had to be done in person. And I wanted to sort of keep going. You don't want to be stalled in your making. So I was just making these abstract elements that I sort of saw as iterations of seed pods from the national park, or lots of different things that I would see when bushwalking up there that, I would sort of want to try and encapsulate, I suppose, in an abstract form. But I just had so many bits, it was a little bit out of control. And they weren't all going to be able to, be on ceramic vessels, or for Natalia to paint them. We were running out of time. We had quite a tight turnaround for that exhibition.
And so most of those, are they mainly, these are wood and some found wood, like fallen wood? Or
yeah, there's definitely some driftwood in there. I mean, I don't know if you can see on the far left, there's a piece there that looks a little bit like a bird's head. That's the seat of a chair that I cut in half, that I've had for quite some time. But Hayley was looking at doing some suspensions of ceramic vessels that her and Natalia had painted. And we had hoped to sort of have a piece where we all collaborated together, but just due to time, Hayley sort of said, why don't you try hanging some of these elements? And yeah, I spoke to her later on and said, thank you. It kind of pushed me out of my comfort zone a little bit, but that idea of playing with those objects in another way, I think it worked really well. So, and I think that it's definitely a work that when seen in person, you can kind of see all of the different little textures and materials that have been used.
I defy anyone to see that in 7 minutes and walk on. Like, I'm sure that would have been interesting, the sort of lingering reflection of how people interacted and viewed the piece. That would have been interesting.
Yeah. It is always interesting to watch people observe things or to interact with things in a gallery. I think that there was a little bit of concern because there's some thorns in that piece on some of the hanging elements, and they're wicked sharp. I mean, this plant that I get these thorns off, it's big leather gloves, and it's never
well, is that what you're using here?
Yeah. They're sort of a finer, a smaller version of that same thorn. So they range up into sort of palm-sized, quite thick thorns, but they're a little delicate one. I just love that idea of something that wants to be picked up and held, or has that tactile quality being subverted by what are quite wickedly sharp thorns. So
yeah. And are they pushed through holes or are they stuck on?
No, you have to sort of do a little drilled hole in, so it's a very delicate process. And the little arms are found pieces of timber, so that you're not, when are you going to find another bit like that? I mean, I managed to find two, so to make the sort of somewhat matching arms. But you kind of are there thinking, if I drill through this or snap it, which happens, that's part of art making, is making mistakes. I'm going to have to rejig this sculpture because, I don't have another little arm like that. So, yeah, it is always a little bit of a tense moment. And, I'm not going to lie and say I haven't. There's not been many things that I haven't been a ball at a gate and broken before. So,
I mean, it's just mind-blowing. I mean, I'm drawn to a lot of those smaller pieces then because of being a fan of the pod, the seed pod and all of that sort of stuff, I'm there. But then, I see these sort of more sophisticated or ornate. So is that a wall hanging or?
Yeah, so that piece, so the sort of a circular piece at the top is a glazed ceramic element by Hayley, and she passed to me and said, if you can use it, you can use it. If you can't, then just return to me. And I don't know, something about the glazing, the forms that Hayley makes, I just really enjoyed responding to, and I enjoyed building in sort of timber textures in contrast and sort of celebrating those natural glazes that she was using, particularly in that circular bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the textures, they're specifically made with a bit on the end of your...
Yeah, so there's this is an exaggerated scale, but there's like a smaller version of this circular burr. And as long as everything's clamped and you've got a steady hand, you can go through and again, I really enjoy those repetitive makings of patterns with the saber-tooth bits.
Yeah, I love that. And I was interested before, you were saying about working on a commission. So that idea of responding to something that either you find or you've been given, could you tell us more about this intriguing piece?
Yeah, he was. It was quite challenging, that commission. It was enjoyable, but yeah, I had lots and lots of sketches of plans. So I was given the central sort of black element without the little spiky timber topper or the handle. It had a different handle on it. From a couple, David Roach and his wife Caroline, who had seen a series of works that I'd done for an exhibition at Wollongong Art Gallery, and had just said, look, we found this, we're not 100% sure what it is, and I sort of put my feelers out amongst some friends who thought maybe an instrument cleaner, still not 100% certain, but they found it in a curio shop when they'd been overseas, and just said, look, if you can make something that responds to it or includes it, and I just found that really difficult. It's funny that as someone who loves using found objects, to be given an object and then to be asked to respond to it was a very different kettle of fish. So because I had that idea in my head of it having some past life, some history as an instrument cleaner, I wanted to sort of look at that idea of making an absurdist instrument. I'm also very inspired by lots of artists, but by the work of Ian Gentle. And I've always loved his sort of absurd quality in the making of his works. If you haven't already seen it, there's a fantastic retrospective exhibition of his works at Wollongong Art Gallery and at Clifton, which, funnily enough, the two people who commissioned this work have put together. But yeah, I loved the idea of making an instrument that was just as peculiar as the thing that was meant to clean it. So yeah, I think they were happy with it, and I think it now resides in their kitchen. They've got a wonderful art collection, so I was honoured to be asked to make that work.
Yeah, I definitely love that. And I love that how instruments and then tools, and now I'm just going to look at the scribing tool, like those categories, those words, how that can then, you know, trigger and an idea of a path to take.
Yeah, I think that it's funny how I don't think as an artist, and I know, Tara, you feel the same, that you can really ever run out of ideas, because things just sort of seem to flow on from them. Like I wouldn't have guessed, you know, a year ago that I'd be making what I'm making now, but these things, the ball just starts to roll. And so I can kind of put those scribing tools, I can ascribe them to a series that I did for my master's, which was exploring mythology and looking at, well, the title of the exegesis was Translating Traditional Narratives into Contemporary Sculptural Forms. But what I was interested in is the idea of, you know, or whether or not myths, traditional tales, those narratives that I was told as a child, and, you know, many children have been told, you know, since the dawn of time, are dying out, or if they're the iterations of them, those sort of Disney iterations, which, you know, I still love, have had so much of that moral purpose removed from them and become so saccharine that they no longer have that same kind of guts to them. You know, like they were there often not just as an interesting tale, but, you know, often to educate. You know, don't go into the forest, you know, be careful of strangers, or whatever the underlying purpose was. So I had made a whole series of works about mythology, which were taking animals from mythological tales, the Minotaur, Icarus, you know, although Icarus was a man with bird wings, and making these sort of marionette jointed puppets. And then that series finished, and that sort of, I felt like that had reached its full stop point, but I was still really interested in that idea of traditional narratives and the telling of traditional narratives, both in spoken and written form. And that led me to thinking about, you know, we know there's a strong oral tradition, like particularly for Indigenous Australians. You know, we know that, you know, there wasn't necessarily that idea of writing Dreamtime stories, for example, down on paper. And that's around the world. You know, those stories were told around the campfire and retold and shifted depending on the, you know, the traveling storyteller's interest. And so I kind of thought about, you know, these storytellers traveling around and telling these stories, but, you know, writing in the dirt by the campfire, or you know, elucidating a point by making a mark on a wall, and what tools might they have used. So, you know, it might be a long bow to draw for some people, but that's where the Scribing Tools series, and there's been 3 series now, where I suppose they become more and more ridiculous, but I love that they, you know, the idea of picking them up and dipping them in ink and trying to scrawl marks, or using the styluses on the ends of them to, you know, to draw in the sand. You know, what marks would they make? You know, what sort of splashes would they make on a canvas? So yeah, that's sort of where those scribing tools they stemmed from.
I can feel the audience out there saying and typing furiously, but are you testing them? Are you using them? Are you doing that?
I have had so many people ask me that. Yeah, I have not yet. I've actually done workshops for galleries where participants have made tools, and then they've used those tools, those brushes, to start beginning to make abstracted marks in response to a narrative. But I haven't used any of these. I would actually love to do it, but I would love to do it with someone, you know, with a performative element, perhaps with someone who's, I don't know, you know, a painter. I'm not a painter, you know, and I don't profess to be, or someone who does calligraphy or yeah. So I'm sure that will eventually happen, and I would definitely would do that with open arms. I'd love to see, you know, someone in movement, you know,
well,
dragging
that
those along.
we did a photo feature artist with Jodie Graham, who one of the things that she has is the hands, and she has mark making.
Yeah, I saw that.
She did a collaborative thing with the cello or double bass, and then it was really
I love that. I mean, it's a lovely, you know, I think that the creative and performing arts, they don't need to be disparate, you know, separated into little categories. It's lovely when they, you know, they're a response to other things. I mean, as I've said, my having the chance to respond to a ceramicist really invigorated my practice. The idea of responding to music or, you know, these things, I think they're an awesome opportunity to extend practice.
And the idea of the masters and that narrative, and you know, I must admit I skimmed through it rather than had a good solid read. But that idea of research is always so interesting, and you know, as artists, we don't normally give ourselves or have that sort of opportunity to research something further. So yeah, I was kind of interested in how you balance that, but then also with those scribing tools, did you feel compelled to kind of like make up a story for each item? Like, did you feel like you had to name it, although it was, you know, like fiction, or just they could just be like?
I am actually quite. I mean, I often do tend towards titles that reveal a little bit, but are also ambiguous, and perhaps, you know, I don't know. I've not spoken to all of my audience, but the titles might not ever resonate with other people, and that's okay. But it's very rare that I would call something what it is, you know, dog with a hammer or whatever. But those were literally titled circular brush, spiral stylus, because I didn't want them to be. I wanted them to still have that utilitarian object feel to them, although they are absurd, and I use that word a lot. But the idea that they are still a tool, you know, they're an art object, they're a sculpture, but I wanted people to imagine themselves picking them up and using them. And I thought if I started to shift into my usual desire to have, you know, these more sort of poetic titles, just because I don't know, I enjoy that. Sometimes they come to me in the middle of the night and I think, yeah, that suits that work perfectly. That would draw away from that idea that for me these are, you know, an absurd tool.
And absurd is such a fantastic word to like use, reclaim, and just have in their vocabulary, because we kind of don't sort of use it anymore. And so many people get bogged down with that. But why? What's it for? Why are you doing that? And you know,
that's right.
The whole point, really.
What's
so I love
purpose?
Not the absurd.
Yeah, that idea. I think of, you know, I suppose you could walk into any artist studio, and I mean, I think, you know, I talk to artist friends and we bemoan the fact that sometimes we picked, you know, we didn't pick, art picks you, I suppose, and it picks you for life. You know, you'll make until you die. But particularly when you're trying to store sculptures, you think, what on earth? Why didn't I get into, I don't know, hockey or something? Because of, you know, but so you have these collections and collections of objects that, what is their purpose? Like, what are they there for? You know, obviously they're an art object and they're an aesthetic object, one would hope, to someone out there. You know, they're not going to tick everyone's boxes. But that to me, I find that, I just love that, because I'm someone who walks the beach and, you know, I'm more interested in what interesting sticks are on the ground and what rocks with naturally bored holes I can find. And, you know, that's an object that 20 other people could have walked past and have literally no interest in, but makes my day when I find it, you know. And I just think it's that idea of observing the world around us and finding pleasure in those small things. And that's what making art is. It's that idea of, well, for me, celebrating the making process, but also beauty for beauty's sake, you know, things that I find aesthetically pleasing, amusing, things that resonate with me, that are in my mind, to be able to put that into physical form. It's joyful. It's when it's working, it's fantastic.
Yeah, the reinvention, and I mean, it's aesthetically ticking all my boxes. But the perfect segue, the title of this one, futile gestures. I mean,
Yeah, so I mean, there are obviously there's brushes on the ends of both of those pieces, and I saw the thorns are actually porcupine thorns that
Wow.
they are harvested. They don't actually even have to kill the porcupine. I would probably struggle if they did, but they shed their quills and then sell them. This company, but I saw them as sort of styluses that could be used to inscribe. But this idea of the brush, twisting over itself and then, also being entwined with another brush. How do you work with that? How do you make that gesture? Is the gesture futile because, once you pick the other brush up, the first brush becomes impossible to use?
Yeah.
But I mean, from a making perspective, I was also just really challenging myself to see how far I could push the material. And that particular timber is really easy to carve, but it's also a lot easier to break. So starting with, very large chunks of timber and carving each of those brushes, in an undulating form without breaking it was part of the challenge for me as well.
So, and again, I can feel the people asking questions. What wood do you mainly work with, and what would you recommend if people wanted to get starting working with wood? What's sort of like the easiest material to start with?
I used to only really work with reclaimed timber. So people would give me stuff, and I've done a garage clean out in the Christmas holidays, and it's actually disgusting how much timber I've got. I've got to stop accepting donations and start using up some stuff, or do a project where I only use what's in the stockpile, I think. But I was also obviously using a lot of found branches and found elements. But in the last sort of 5 years, I'd seen a work, and it's a permanent part of the Art Gallery New South Wales collection, so they often put it out, but a work by 𝗞𝘁𝗲, an Australian sculptor, called Killing Time. And if you haven't seen it, Google it. It's phenomenal. It's a life-size timber dining table upon which is this feast of sea creatures and seafood, and his father and his family are fishermen. It's got an amazing title of Killing Time, which both, spoke about the act of, farming the sea, but it also spoke about the carving act as something that kills time, like it, not in the way of, I've got to go and kill some time, but hours fly past, and yet, when you see how ridiculous his carving is. Anyway, so I had seen that he had carved with jeweler tong, and I sourced my timber from a specialist place in Marrickville called Anagoat Timber, and just contacted them and said, did they have jeweler tong? And they did. And yeah, so that's jeweler tong is a really great timber to start with. It has a cross grain, so if you've ever picked up a piece of timber and pushed a chisel on it, you might have found that it fights you a little bit, particularly when you're starting out. But jeweler tong doesn't have a directional grain; it's sort of mixed grain. It's mixed direction, so it means that carving it is quite a pleasure. I also really love its color, that kind of pale, creamy color. But I was sort of pushing the envelope with how far it could take me. It's great when you're laminating big chunks, but once you start to get into finer details, it starts to snap and break, which is just, you've got to expect that. You can only push it so far.
Is that an Indonesian-based timber, and is that the blonde kind of coloured wood?
Yeah, so this one that's jeweler tong. There is mahogany. So I ended up contacting that timber company and just saying, look, I sent them some photos of things that I'd broken and saying, what can you suggest? And then I ordered some of the mahogany from them, and they also sent me down some white beech, which has, as the name would probably indicate, a similar colour to the jeweler tong, but is a lot sturdier. So it's a lot harder to carve. Retrospective, like in comparison to jeweler tong, it's harder to carve. Jeweler tong's very expensive, so I'm a big one for not throwing anything out. You probably gathered that by the comment on my stockpile of timber. So I sort of retain bits and try and reuse. But yeah, just if anyone's out there going to research it, just be aware it's not super cheap. But
And when you say carve by hand, do you mean like with those little chisels, you know, like those little things?
Yeah,
like,
yeah. So, yeah, definitely. I've shown you a lot of power tools, but hand carving's a big part of my practice. So I've got a big collection of chisels. I don't particularly enjoy sharpening them, so I used to have a lovely friend who sharpen them for me, but I'm back to sharpening them myself, unfortunately. But yeah, they like sanding. If you want to be a timber sculptor, you gotta learn how to sharpen your tools, and you've got to be okay with sanding.
Yeah, there's people that run courses just on sharpening tools. Now, time's running. But we did mention sea animals and things before, so I just kind of want to go back to well, this is new for you, the Plankton series. So tell us how you suddenly got interested in plankton, and yeah, more about your current project.
Yeah, so I mean, I've always been interested in the natural world. One of my friends calls me a bird nerd, and I've been, you know, I'm a big fan of David Attenborough and have been since I've been a very young child. So there's it's not a massive surprise to anyone that knows me that plankton are of interest, but it sort of actually began, my partner and I did a trip to Tonga to swim with humpback whales. Wow. They come in there, the mums with their babies. It's beautiful, warm, protected waters. We had the opportunity to stay at a really amazing resort called Kitesurf Tonga. They didn't really have any other guests, and the only reason was they usually booked out. Tonga had just opened their doors again. They sort of were quite reticent to reopen their borders post-COVID. Most countries had, and they still hadn't. So we were just on, you know, we just timed it where most people didn't realise the borders were open, and we just had the place to ourselves. So we were diving with whales, and it would be an amazing experience if you had 50 people in the water, which I don't necessarily think you ever would over there. It's generally smaller groups, but it was just me and my partner and the dive master. So to say it, you know, it is life-changing to watch, you know, a baby humpbacked whale kind of swim up and, you know, be 2 arms lengths from you and make eye contact with you. Yeah, I'm sure the audience can understand it was wonderful, but I really needed to do something with that feeling. And one of the things I did was to decide to really focus on my art making and to make that my full-time job rather than trying to scrape time for it, as I'd been doing for the last sort of 15 years. And the other was to decide, like, how do I don't want to really come back and carve sculptures of whales. I mean, I think there's plenty of people out there doing that and doing that really well. I mean, that idea, that concern that I have, and I think a lot of people have, of, you know, extinction of species and, you know, loss of diversity in our natural world. It's wonderful to see a whale, but the whale doesn't exist without that underpinning of all of the food network. And we know that, but plankton aren't sexy creatures. You know, they're not like the pin-up creature like an artist wants to do a Sumatran tiger or an orangutan, and again, I suppose it's that absurd, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know where it comes from. Maybe it's my auntie making me watch Monty Python when I was a child, but I just enjoy absurdity, and I enjoy, I enjoy that kind of looking at the strange and, you know, what might be uninteresting. But for me, I these are all also inspired. Once I came back from Tonga, I sort of started to delve into it. There's an artist called 𝗞𝘁𝗲 and he's done heaps of natural illustration stuff, but he like, I don't know how many years of his life he must have spent just documenting sea creatures, natural forms of all different kinds. So yeah, sort of started with him as a starting point, and then began to make these, like, they're all handheld. So this is probably I think this is the biggest one at the moment anyway. 3-dimensional iterations. They're definitely an artistic interpretation. So if anyone out there is a scientist or, you know, really knows plankton, please don't be upset. They're not photographic representations, and that's just because I get carried away and enjoy stretching and morphing the inspiration photo. But yeah, that's It's a series that I had to put on hold temporarily in 2023 whilst I focused on the group exhibition at Hazelhurst. And then I went down a rabbit hole of doing the wall hangings. But 2024, I'm definitely returning to these guys. I've got some plans for a work that will feature them as sort of a group exhibition. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. I don't know when that will be completed, but yeah, keep you posted.
So interesting. I mean, it's hard to keep up with you as you're talking because you're just sharing generously so many things. And you know,
I'm so sorry. And it do talk a mile a minute. I start if I've ever in a job interview, I start by saying, you know, I talk a mile a minute. So just tell me to slow down if you need me to. Anytime I get excited, yeah, a mile a minute.
So it's fabulous. And yeah, just all that. Yeah, just because I think a lot of people like hearing that inspiration, that's one thing. And then for some people, they go, yeah, so you were swimming and that was great. And then, you know, now I'm seeing these things. So, you know, to just share part of your process there, I think is, yeah, so generous. And
yeah, you can get from A to B via C, you know, like I think that's the artist mind, isn't it? You know, what seems obvious, a pathway to us from A to B may not sort of come across. And I think that's why artist statements are always so hard for artists, because it seems, you know, obvious to us, but may not necessarily be to the audience.
Yeah, yeah. And I love that connection of the absurd and then also through objects, but then like almost like the logical next step. Logical is probably not the right word in this instance.
There's never
applying that to the natural world, because lots of artists have come up with reimagined species and you know, reimagined landscapes and reimagined creatures and botanicals and specimens. And then kind of as we, you know, the climate change and the extinction takes effect, you know, to then come up with our own versions of things that don't actually exist. I think that's really interesting as a creative, you know.
Yeah, and where, you know, I mean, I think I'm also, my interest is piqued by the idea of where evolution could potentially, you know, take animal species. You know, things are starting to adapt to the changing conditions of our world. So yeah, it is an interesting and probably endless source of inspiration for future works for me. We'll see where it goes. That's the exciting part. You know, you probably need another 100, 200 years of life to be able to scratch the surface as an artist of the things that you want to make.
And I can't imagine that you're anyone that ever comes across creative block. But there's kind of that, like, do you? But then also the other part of that is when you're looking at your masters and the narratives, were there artists that particularly inspired or influenced your line of inquiry at all into that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and yes, I do suffer from block. I mean, and I want to dispel the notion, and I you know, did as a high school teacher, that art making is always pleasant. You know, sometimes you'd prefer to organise your sock drawer than go down in the studio. Like, honestly, like, it's like you've got a sulky child sitting on a studio bench and you have literally cajoled, you have tried bribery, you have tried, you know, every single technique you possibly can to get, in my case, this sculpture to behave and resolve itself, and it just won't. So I've got the luxury of time, in the sense that unless there's an exhibition looming, I can generally put that sulky child over in the corner and move on to something else, basically.
And you were talking about the Disneyfication and fairy tales and all of those sort of things. And again, like looking through your masters, I was interested to when you mentioned Mr. Finch, because I think a lot of textile and fiber people out there will know that. Yeah, and I think that was surprising, because again, I wouldn't see the little sort of cute, again, it's probably not the right word, but you know, that sort of that, and then sitting alongside someone who's now working in wood and all those organic spiky forms. I don't necessarily see that those, you know, that you're in.
And look, people may not, but for me, I mean, I'd seen his practice, and again, it's probably Instagram, which is just such a wonderful. It can be a, you know, a minefield, but it's a wonderful way to extend the artists that you see. You know, you can go to as many exhibitions as you want, but it's just, there are so many artists out there doing amazing things. And by typing in a hashtag of timber sculpture or assemblage, you know, you can really sort of start to, you know, dig into a whole bunch of artist practices that you never had the opportunity to see. So I'm pretty sure that's where I found Mr. Finch's work. And I love the craftsmanship of his works. I love the way that he celebrates the found object as well, like little thimbles and antique spoons and finds. He recently, well, I think it was maybe a year or so ago, he brought out a book, and he had one of the characters that he'd made going on this journey. And they're just, again, that idea of narrative, you know, these little stories that were being explored by one of the characters he'd made, that just resonates with me, because I love traditional narratives, whatever culture they're from. I love the way different cultures tell, you know, Russian mythology, you know, their kind of folkloric tales are super interesting. The monsters and the, you know, the sort of fairy tale creatures are so different from Celtic narratives, or, you know, I'm sure that people have, you know, scratched the surface a little bit of that. But I find his work beautiful. I'd love to be able to sew like he sews, and I did dabble after I first met him in trying to, when I was making the marionette timber puppets, in stitching some. But it's just fibre for me is the use of horsehair and straw and grasses, and that's, I sort of think, where the fibre comes into my sculptural practice, maybe in the future.
Yeah, and people are probably asking, you know, are you foraging for your fibres, or are you repurposing found existing household objects?
Yeah, both. I mean, I've got a friend who's got horses, and I often say, "Can you ready to chop your horse's tail again for me?" I'm a big fan of the Vietnamese broom, which you'll see outside of their grocery stores, and the lovely lady down the road from me who has an amazing grocery store must think I am the cleanest person in the world, because I go and buy 4 or 5 at a time. So they're great, those straw brooms. I've actually tried, because I feel bad about the fact that I cut off the end of the broom, and I've yet to sort of find a purpose for that, a repurposing, I suppose, just to buy the fibre. But it's actually so difficult to just buy that fibre. So yeah, it's interesting. But I have gone and, you know, been the crazy lady out in the, you know, on the unmowed curb cutting grass heads, or my dad came with me recently because he knows I'm a nutbag, and we went and harvested willow withes because I was doing a workshop where I wanted willow withes. So yeah, look, you know, if I find something that interests me, I have no qualms in collecting it. And the clean out of my garage made me realise that I probably need to just pause for a bit and use what I've got, because I've got tubs and tubs of stuff.
Well, I'm sure after this, I knew it would be fabulous. And, you know, I'm sure people go, oh, wooden sculpture, I don't know, that's not really me. But, you know, like, I'm sure so many people have got a lot out of this, and I encourage them all to come and look at your Instagram and see what you're up to. And before we wrap up, so what does 2024 have in store for you, and what are you working on or looking forward to in the upcoming months?
Well, I'll be painting a lot of murals, because that's my other job around New South Wales schools. But I have a residency with a organisation called Burnt Dirt, which is obviously with ceramics. So I'm really excited. I'm not a ceramicist, but I am interested to see what comes of working with them, because it's a big focus on collaboration and seeing, you know, my responding to their works and vice versa. I've got a big thrust towards, there's a couple of, particularly with the Plankton, there's some things that I really want to get resolved there. So I think that my focus this year will be tying up some loose ends and potentially entering them into some competitions. But I think my focus is just being able to have that luxury at the moment of focusing solely on my art making. So we'll see where the year takes me in regards to exhibitions and shows. I'll keep you guys posted if you on Instagram. Reach out.
Hopefully more residencies, Plankton, and with the soft draw. Yeah, I'm going to have that as a quote. Like, I'd rather do my soft draw. No. So thank you again. It's been fabulous, and you're so generous, and I've loved hearing more about all the stories and the narratives and all of the things that inspire you and your work. And also thank you to everyone for tuning in, and we do appreciate you listening to us. And please, yes, we'd love to hear from you, particularly
happy to answer
comments. Yes, so
yeah,
Kate would love to answer questions. So yes, Kate, if you just hang there for a moment and I'll play our outro. And thank you everybody, and thank you Kate, and see you next time.
Thanks all.